this notion of a maximum or an infinite in its kind as characterizing the status of creatures can shed any light on the question of how these metaphysical imperfections can be the source of moral imperfections that Leibniz ascribes to intelligent creatures. And I take it this is a question that comes up again and again in Maria Rosa's paper. So to examine this question, I'd like to consider very briefly one of Leibniz's curious illustrations of imperfection as privation. The notion of perfections in the plural, of course, play a major role here. As we know, according to Leibniz, every being is constituted and defined by virtue of a unique combination of perfections or positive attributes. Roughly speaking, this is a version of the complete concept of the individual. Each such concept, as I've suggested it elsewhere, correspond to a certain rule that generates a unique structure of predicates as a thought in God's understanding. Notice that the fact that such a structure is unique is the other side of the coin of its being limited. Its uniqueness implies a particular combination which reflects not only what it is, but also what it's not. And in this sense, every unique combination of perfections also shows or represents what the creature lacks relative to the absolute perfection of the Creator. A very interesting articulation of this model of privation appears in Leibniz's curious analogy between creation and the binary notation, where the number 1 represents perfection and 0 represents privation. In the context of drawing this analogy, Leibniz writes, the privative is nothing but limits, and there are limits everywhere in the creature, just as there are points everywhere in a line. So clearly, he sees that there are infinitely many limitations in every creature. Now, the complementary image of such a unique concept, which eventually would correspond to a complete concept of an individual, represented by a combination of zeros or privations, is what it or what the creature could have but does not have. Such a complementary image refers, in some sense, to the whole of logical space of possible things conceived in God's understanding. Ultimately, it refers to all the positive perfections conceived in all possible manners by the divine mind, the famous pays des possibles. And this is how, I quote, the original limitation that the creature could not but receive with the first beginning of its being is ultimately related to the ideal reasons which restrict it. The ideal reasons I read as referring to, as Maria Rosa pointed out, to the notion of possibility and all possible things conceived in God's mind. Now, while this model provides an illustration of what Leibniz might mean by privation, it is very unclear how such a model, which fixes the positive and negative properties of creatures, can be the source of morality, if morality, according to Leibniz, requires spontaneous action and rational judgment, which, of course, it does. And in this connection, in the couple minutes that I still have, I would like to mention a suggestion which I made in chapter 6 of my book regarding what I call a prescriptive reading of the complete concept of the individual seen as an actualization of a unique possibility. So what may serve to translate the notion of a fixed set of attributes or perfections into the realm of action is that we can see the complete concept of an individual not merely as a combination of attribute, but also as a program prescribing rather than causally determining a unique course of action. But if any creature is to be defined through a certain program of action, what could distinguish between rational and non-rational beings? The unique, but therefore limited prescription of action of each creature may also account for the cognitive limitations imposed by the partiality and imperfection of such a being. Now, the main difference is that rational beings have a capacity for reflection and for judgment regarding their own actions. And in this reading, the individual actions which correspond to their predicates need not be seen as unmediated results of the individual concept, conceived either as result of logical deduction or mechanical execution, but rather rational individuals are agents who act according to the reasons that inclines them most. And here I'd like to mention, it's very useful to mention a point made by Mike Murray in the previous session, that we could think about the way reasons incline creatures along the line of moral necessity, but suited to creaturely activity rather to divine activity. I think that a lot of this model can be adopted also to the question of human reason rather than in the following way. So one way in which this limitation is expressed is the way in which creatures employ the principle of the best. Unlike God, creatures do not act according to the absolutely best. Rather, creatures act in accordance with what seems best to them. This means that intelligent creatures act according to their unique but also limited point of view and limited cognitive capacities. And it is perhaps in this sense that Leibniz sees the metaphysical imperfections as privations in the creature's programs or concepts as the sources of their moral imperfections, so applying to their actions and judgments. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't really have to respond in the sense that you have put my contribution in a broader context more than raising specific issues or criticizing specific points. So thank you for this broader picture that you have presented. Just one little clarification. I think it is not at issue in my paper whether metaphysical imperfection is or is not the source of moral evil and physical evil, because it is clear that metaphysical imperfection is the source of this moral and physical evil insofar as it provides the possibility for limited creatures to choose to sin and therefore to suffer the consequences of this sin. So I don't think this is what is at issue here. Rather is at issue what we should understand by this notion of metaphysical evil. And then a very small point when you proposed this model of creaturely limitation having the created substance between the absolute infinite being and infinite mathematical things, between absolute being and non-being. I wouldn't regard infinite mathematical things as non-being. They are beings of reason, but they still have a degree of reality.
Thank you. And you are invited to ask questions. Please.
Well, thank you very much, Mary Rosa. It was a really nice talk, and I particularly found illuminating the way which you showed that metaphysical evil is not a univocal concept. There's different kinds of ideas that built up into it. But I wanted to push you on two texts with respect to the final idea that you come to explain the original imperfection in terms of the origin ex nihilo. And two things. One is that it seems to me that there is more textual evidence for the Neoplatonic type account than perhaps you wanted to allow. And whether or not this is actually a systematic part of Leibniz's view, he certainly comes back again and again to those sorts of images, and in particular the one about in the preface to the Theodicy, the perfections of God are those of our souls, but he possesses them in boundless measure. He is an ocean where we are only drops that has been granted. And so that kind of idea you know, lots of texts, I think we find that idea. There's a fulguration or a pouring forth of God's being into finite